When an avoidant loses the best thing they ever had, their first move is rarely emotional, it's mental. It's strategic, it's protective. Instead of collapsing under the weight of the loss, they instinctively start building a narrative one that shields them from the raw vulnerability of having cared that deeply in the first place. And this isn't because they're heartless or detached. It's because the avoidant attachment style has, over time, taught them one thing above all else. Emotional closeness is risky. So when something real is lost, when someone who genuinely mattered walks away, they don't process it the way most people would. They rationalize it, not to understand it, but to survive it. You see, the avoidant mind isn't just trying to explain what happened. It's trying to control the emotional impact of what happened. So rather than sit with the ache, rather than admit that they lost something precious, they default to an intellectual defense mechanism. It wasn't meant to be. They were too needy. We just wanted different things. On the surface, these sound like reasonable reflections. But when you dig deeper, you start to realize these statements aren't rooted in clarity. They're rooted in fear, fear of truly confronting how much the loss actually hurts. Because to an avoidant, acknowledging the emotional depth of that connection would mean confronting a truth that threatens their entire identity, that they do need connection, that they were seen, and that, despite all their efforts to stay safe behind those walls, someone got through. That's terrifying. So instead of grieving, they retreat into logic. They talk themselves out of the pain. They frame the relationship as flawed, or themselves as too flawed to have ever sustained it. You missing it. This rationalization isn't malicious. It's protective. In their world, loss isn't just about a relationship ending. It's a perceived failure of emotional control. Vulnerability for them has always been linked to abandonment, engulfment, or loss of self. So, when that vulnerability ends in heartbreak, the conclusion they draw isn't "I cared deeply, and it didn't work." It's "See, this is why I don't get close." They reinforce the very belief that keeps them lonely. They mistake safety for strength. They confuse disconnection for healing. But here's where the deeper tragedy lies. By rationalizing away the depth of what they lost, they also rob themselves of the opportunity to grow from it. When we lose someone meaningful, that pain has the power to reshape us. It can teach us, soften us, humble us. But only if we face it honestly. Avoidants often skip this stage entirely. They avoid the heartbreak by rewriting the story. And in doing so, they miss the very transformation that loss can bring. Now, if you've ever been on the receiving end of this, if you were the one they pushed away, only to later watch them act as if it didn't matter, you know how confusing and invalidating that can be. It feels like you were invisible, but in reality, you were anything but invisible. You triggered something so deep in them, so significant, that the only way they knew how to handle it was by denying it ever mattered. Not because it didn't, but because it mattered too much, and eventually the cracks begin to show. Not immediately. Avoidants are masters at keeping their feelings compartmentalized. But months later, maybe even years, it surfaces. A memory hits, a song plays, a moment of quiet lands a little too heavily, and suddenly the rationalization starts to feel hollow. The story no longer protects them. It haunts them. They realize they didn't just lose a person, they lost the person. The one who saw them. The one who stayed longer than they should have, hoping they'd come closer. And by the time that realization fully settles in, it's too late. The door has closed. The moment has passed. And now they're left with the echo of something they never fully allowed themselves to feel. The truth is, loss doesn't destroy avoidant. It exposes them. It brings to the surface all the defenses they've lived behind, and for some, that moment of clarity can become a turning point, but only if they're willing to stop rationalizing and start reflecting. Only if they're willing to stop saying it wasn't real and start asking, why couldn't I receive it when it was? Because in the end, the most painful thing isn't losing the best thing you ever had. It's realizing you talked yourself out of it before you ever fully experienced it. And that's the weight avoidants carry, not just the loss of love, but the loss of what could have been if only they'd let it in. After an avoidant loses the best thing they ever had, their instinct isn't to seek comfort. It's to seize control, not necessarily of the person they were with, but of everything else, because underneath the cold exterior, there's a chaos they're trying to avoid. Real connection touched a nerve, and now that it's gone, they're left with a gaping hole where certainty used to be. So instead of mourning the loss emotionally, they manage it behaviorally. They retreat into their world, their routines, their independence, even their distractions, as a way to reassert control over a life that suddenly feels unfamiliar. You'll often hear people say things like, he moved on so fast, or she's acting like nothing happened. But what looks like indifference on the outside is often a desperate internal reorganization. The avoidant doesn't process pain outwardly. They don't call a friend, cry, or write a long reflective journal entry. They micromanage their environment. They clean, they plan, they dive into work, or jump headfirst into the next emotionally unthreatening relationship. It's not that they've moved on. It's that they're trying to shrink the emotional world back to something they can control. Control is their way of coping with powerlessness, losing someone who got close, someone who broke through their walls feels like being exposed. And for someone with an avoidant blueprint, that exposure is intolerable. Emotional intimacy to them isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Because it implies dependency, it implies need, and for avoidance, needing someone has often been associated with disappointment, abandonment, or feeling engulfed. So when they finally do need someone and then lose them, it validates their deepest fear. That closeness leads to pain. So what do? They replace connection with control, not just over their space or their schedule, but over their emotional narrative. They become hyper, autonomous. They remind themselves that they never really needed anyone to begin with. And the more they repeat this to themselves, the more they reinforce the illusion that losing someone wasn't a loss, it was freedom. But of course, it's not freedom. It's fear masquerading as empowerment. They'll often pursue shallow or short-lived connections soon after the breakup, not because they're callous, but because depth feels too risky. Surface-level affection is safe, it's manageable, it doesn't demand vulnerability, and more importantly, it doesn't threaten their emotional defenses. These replacement relationships serve a function. They restore a sense of control that was lost when they were truly seen. They'll say they're just exploring, focusing on themselves, or keeping things light. But the truth is, they're avoiding the deeper wound because that wound threatens to undo the identity they've carefully built around independence. This is what makes the avoidant journey so paradoxical. They crave closeness, but the moment it gets too real, they sabotage it. And when they lose it, they don't reach for healing, they reach for order. They fixate on what they can control, because the one thing they couldn't control, the loss of a meaningful bond, feels too destabilizing to sit with. But here's where it gets even more complicated. That pursuit of control might offer short-term relief, but long-term, it deepens the loneliness because eventually the dust settles. The routines no longer distract. The next partner doesn't compare. And there, in the quiet, reality sets in. They didn't just lose someone, they lost someone they may never find again. And no amount of control can bring that back. This is where growth becomes possible, but only if they pause long enough to recognize what's driving their behavior. Not strength, not clarity, but fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of losing themselves, fear of not being enough, or worse, of being seen fully and still not chosen. If they can see that, even for a moment, then there's a crack in the armor. And from that crack, something deeper can emerge, not just a realization of what they lost, but of why they couldn't hold onto it in the first place. Because healing for an avoidant doesn't come from staying in control. It comes from surrendering control, just enough to feel, to reflect, to stop managing emotions like a risk portfolio and start experiencing them like a human being. And ironically, that's where true strength lies, not in how tightly you can hold your boundaries, but in how bravely you can open again after you've been hurt. So, if you've been through this, if you recognize this pattern in someone else, or maybe even in yourself, remember this. Control may protect you from pain, but it also prevents you from love. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of control and allow yourself to feel what you've spent a lifetime trying to avoid. One of the most painful truths about avoidance is that they often don't realize what they've lost until long after it's gone. Not because they didn't care, not because the relationship didn't matter, but because they couldn't afford to admit how much it mattered. Not while it was still real, not while there was still a chance to do something about it. That level of vulnerability, that raw emotional truth, is simply too threatening when you're wired to protect, not to connect. So what do they do instead? They downplay, they distract. They tell themselves the story they need to believe to avoid emotional collapse. It wasn't that serious. I wasn't ready. They were asking too much, and that story becomes their shield. It keeps them safe from the full weight of the loss. But here's the thing about stories, they only work for so long. Time has a way of softening defenses. And when the distractions wear off and the silence settles in, the truth starts to seep through. It usually happens in quiet, unremarkable moments, driving past a familiar place, hearing their favorite song, opening a drawer and finding something they left behind. Suddenly, the version of the story that kept them sane begins to crack. It's in these moments that the avoidant finally starts to feel. But here's the twist. They only let themselves feel once it's safe, once there's no risk of vulnerability. Once the person they lost has moved on, or closed the door, or stopped waiting, only then can they afford to acknowledge the truth. I lost someone irreplaceable. And by then, of course, it's too late. This delayed emotional reckoning is not just sad, it's self-sabotage in slow motion. Because it means that the avoidant doesn't get to experience love fully when it's right in front of them. They experience it in hindsight. They connect the dots backward, and what could have been a lie, faltering relationship becomes a haunting lesson they replay in their minds. Not because they didn't have a chance, but because they didn't take it when it mattered. And this is what separates avoidance from those who are truly open to love. Most people feel the loss in real time. They cry, they talk, they heal, but avoidants delay that process. They suppress the sadness, thinking they've outsmarted the pain. But the cost is enormous. Because when the emotional dam finally breaks, they're not just grieving a person, they're grieving their own inability to show up when it counted. You see, there's a kind of tragedy in realizing something too late. It's the heartbreak that comes with hindsight, with clarity arriving after the window has closed. And the avoidant often walks away from that realization not just with regret, but with a sense of existential dissonance. Why did I push them away? Why couldn't I just let myself feel it then? Why did I run from the very thing I now miss? And those questions don't fade quickly. They linger, they become part of the avoidant's internal narrative, the quiet awareness that they had something rare and real, and they let it slip through their fingers. Not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much to admit it while it still mattered, because that would have required lowering the shield. And for someone who's been emotionally self-reliant their whole life, that's the hardest thing to do. But this isn't where the story has to end, because that pain, that realization that hits in the aftermath, can become a turning point. It can wake them up to patterns they've been repeating for years. And if they're willing, it can teach them something they've never truly learned before, that love is not something to be managed or minimized. It's something to be embraced in the moment, fully, even if it comes with risk. Because what hurts more than losing the best thing you ever had is knowing you never fully received it while it was in your hands. That you waited to feel safe before you allowed yourself to care, that you postponed love until it was gone. And for anyone listening who recognizes themselves in that, whether you're the one who lost someone or the one trying to understand why someone pulled away, let this be the lesson. Don't wait for safety of hindsight to feel the truth that's in front of you today. Love requires courage now, not later. And no amount of control or timing or rationalization will ever substitute for the raw, present moment vulnerability that love demands. Because at the end of the day, realizing something too late doesn't just cost you a relationship. It costs you the chance to be fully alive in the moments that mattered most.